I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Palawa peoples of Tasmania, and I would like to also acknowledge their elders and their continuing custodianship of this wonderful land here in northwest Tasmania. I'm here today with my colleague, Dr. Kiros Hiruy, and we are from the Centre for Social Impact Swinburne node, and Kiros is up in Melbourne and I'm in Tassie at our Region Link program. And we have the wonderful opportunity today to talk with you a bit about some work we've been doing on the topic of social cohesion, which is an area of work that some of you may be very familiar with, and some of you may not be familiar with at all, because it is a particular body of policy and academic practice. And also to talk about how we have taken quite a different approach to social cohesion, a place-based approach, working with one of the councils in the Melbourne metropolitan fringe. So before I jump into this content, I would also like to acknowledge our co-investigators who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but both Russell Hopkins and Belgin Bessem, Russell formerly of Whittlesea City Council and Belgin currently the Community Services Director at Whittlesea City Council, were active collaborators on this project, and also must be acknowledged they were also co-authors of the report, which will shortly be available. So if we could pop onto the next screen, please. So this project actually started from a local government base. My background is regional and rural development. I'm an anthropologist, and I've spent most of my career working at the local level with local communities and often with local government, but very often in rural regions, in low population places. So this project for me was a bit of an adventure because it took place in the city of Whittlesea in the peri-urban fringe of metropolitan Melbourne in an extremely high growth local community. So it was a real opportunity to take what Kiros and I as anthropologists who study community development out of the traditional community development context of, quite local communities, neighborhoods, or quite often rural communities, into a very, very high growth urban context. And the other thing that was really interesting about this particular context where we went to work and to partner with the city of Whittlesea was that this was a context that I think we could refer to as hyper diverse or super diverse. Even from the simple metric of where people were from, over a third of the population of these local communities were born overseas, and nearly half speak a language other than English at home. And that not just one language, I think over 100 languages spoken in this one local area, this one local government area. And this was the context we entered, and the task before us was a really interesting one, because this particular local government area, the city of Whittlesea, in their 2040 plan, had a very specific aspiration for social cohesion. And they recognized that in an extremely diverse, fast-growing context, where the community is actually multiple communities that do not necessarily connect with each other, that social cohesion was going to be really important going forward. And they recognized this at the local government level. And so they approached us at the Centre for Social Impact to talk about this. So social cohesion has been talked a lot about, as I mentioned at the beginning, in policy circles and also in academic circles. But the policy imperative for social cohesion has very often come at the national or international level. And it's particularly come in response to situations of hypermobility. So as more and more people travel and move about the world more, the traditional local community, the rural community or the neighborhoods that, you had people there and their parents had been there and their grandparents had been there, is incredibly rare these days. Most local communities are made up of people who are from a lot of places, who may have lived locally all their lives or who may have lived locally for a week or two. And how do you create a community and a sense of connection among people as a community in these really diverse settings? So at national policy levels, in various country contexts, countries have said, how do we actually build a sense of ourselves as a nation, given that we now have people that weren't necessarily born here and may speak many different languages and don't necessarily have easy points of cultural connection with each other. We started the project by kind of looking at what the international policy framework around social cohesion was. And we've put here on the slide just a couple of quotes. There's the one from the OECD. The one from the OECD, which is basically looking at the fighting of exclusion, of marginalization via creation of a sense of belonging. So this idea that you've got people from multiple groups, but there's a common policy aim to ensure everybody has access to economic opportunities, everyone has access to social opportunities, and a recognition, which I think is really important to flag, that this is facilitated by a sense of community, by people feeling as though they have something in common with other people, that they would hire their neighbour for a job, that they would hire other people for a job that maybe speak a different language or from a different place. I've also popped up on the screen the EU approach. Obviously, the EU, being a very diverse polity in its own right, has grappled with questions of social cohesion at that level. Let's go on to the next slide, because what's really interesting about the policy focus is it does differ across country context. In Australia, the focus on social cohesion has been, obviously as everywhere, on diversity and the creation of community across diversity, but particularly on a context of immigration and multiculturalism. So it's kind of come out of multicultural policy. Again, though, the themes are similar. How do you enable social cohesion? Social cohesion defined as connections, shared sense of belonging, attachment, sense of community. And I think I'd like to just pause for a moment there and reflect on our particular international environment at the moment, and the fact that you've got supranational bodies and nations recognizing since the 90s that this thing called social cohesion matters, and that maybe if we don't have it, that there's going to be fragmentation and there's going to be conflict and there's not going to be equitable access to economic and social opportunities in a society. And I think what we're seeing now happening, particularly in the States, is a sober reminder of what happens when social cohesion becomes fragmented and becomes a situation of social fragmentation where people don't feel a sense of community or affinity with one another. So it was really interesting for me reflecting this week on this project, and what do we have to say to this international context? Certainly our work with the City of Whittlesea, I think, has some really important lessons for these national and international preoccupations. So if we could move to the next slide. We did this extensive review of the policy literature. We also did a review of the academic literature. There is an academic literature on social cohesion, how to define it and how to measure it. And we came up with a working definition, which I wanted to share at the beginning. We can debate points of the definition, and indeed this definition evolved through our work. But it's a good starting point: bonding between people and groups of people from diverse backgrounds who, through their interactions, develop common values and civic culture. So the elements here are diversity and bonding to create a sense of commonality, a sense of community or shared culture. So on to the next slide. So we knew that the literature sort of had a broad idea of what social cohesion is and what some of the elements of social cohesion might be. But what we discovered is that despite the fact that the City of Whittlesea, like a number of other local governments, actually had social cohesion front and centre in their strategic document, almost no work had been done internationally on, well, what is a local approach to social cohesion? What is a place-based approach to social cohesion? Not a national approach or an international statement as to what, societies need to look like. How could we actually take these ideas and ground them in a local community? So this was our mission when we set out to undertake this piece of research, is we wanted to take what is known from the international policy literature, what is known from the international academic literature, and bring that together with the on-the-ground experience, in all of its diversity in a local government area. So this project, which we conducted last year, we used the knowledge partnering methodology, which is about bringing together knowledge across boundaries. And we worked very closely with both council employees and members of the community, particularly leadership and membership of active community groups across sectors, to really understand, okay, our council says social cohesion is important. What does that mean for us? What does the presence of social cohesion look like? Do we have some examples? What does the absence of social cohesion look like? Can we give some examples of that? And what can we do as a community, and what can our local government do to promote more cohesive communities here in this specific local place? So that was our mission, and it was a lot of fun. We basically spent about 3 months going back and forth up to Whittlesea, working with community groups, working with groups of staff, working with various organizations across the board, so Aboriginal organizations, immigrant organizations, organizations working with young people, with older people, community activists and so forth, including some that were specifically involved in multicultural spaces. And we took a working framework, which Kiros will tell you about in a moment, which is what you can see in this picture. And we said, well, this is what the literature says the elements or the pieces of social cohesion are, the kind of indicators we might use to measure it. What do you think? Have a play with it. Pull it apart. And some people actually snipped it apart and put it back together again. So I'm going to hand it over to Kiros to tell you what we found out through this process.
Thanks, Robyn. I will take you through the literature review, and perhaps towards the end I would also talk about our findings from the fieldwork. Social cohesion is a broad body of knowledge, and there are different voices in the literature. What we found is that a place-based social cohesion can be expressed differently. As you can see here, Bernard, in some cases, express it in economic, political, social, cultural, and physical infrastructure together. And there are also arguments that it could be expressed through other means like community members, community organizations, businesses, governments, and public services coming together in a place to design and implement innovative solutions. This is perhaps akin to what we call like local impact work, different organizations working in a local area, a place-based approach. From this, what we found on the ground is slightly different from what the literature says. There is an element of civic participation where we were told that there is participatory decision making is considered as an element of social cohesion, broad representations, community political leadership, and things like that. There is a socio-cultural element which is related with information access, connecting with new communities, sharing cultures. Another element would be community infrastructure, which is particularly important in local government areas, which includes accessibility, green spaces, art and cultural spaces, even community radio, and built and natural environment. The economic element deals with economic participation, And we have also, people felt that environment is also at one element of social cohesion, which is related with green spaces, mobility, and connectedness. The elements of social cohesion in the literature are also expressed in different terms, in terms of what the outcomes of social cohesion are. These are belonging, recognition, inclusion, participation, and legitimacy. In a short while, I will talk about the elements of social cohesion, what happens if you have strong social cohesion, and what happens if you have weak social cohesion. Elements of social cohesion can be expressed both in binary forms. What happens when you have it, or what happens when you don't have it. For instance, if there is a strong social cohesion, you expect to see belonging, growing, and inclusion, participation, recognition, and legitimacy. But if it's weak social cohesion, then there will be isolation, exclusion, non-involvement, rejection, illegitimacy, and in some cases, which can lead to community conflict and things like that, as Robyn mentioned, like the one we are currently observing in the United States. The benefits of social cohesion are many, but they could be different at different levels, at the national, state, and local level. In general, though, social cohesion can contribute to building community resilience, and you would expect that communities with strong social cohesion would have low crime rates, high economic growth, low unemployment, and of course, happy citizens. But the opposite is also true. If there is no social cohesion, then there is the possibility of increased crimes and economic, the opposite of economic growth, basically, and high unemployment and things like that. Social cohesion is very important in terms of, particularly in EU, the focus is particularly on sustaining economic development, but also important for political stability. The literature talks about how social cohesion can be used to stabilize politics. If communists can work together, then you would expect that they would have stable politics. Social cohesion can also contribute to poverty reduction and sustaining long-term growth. This is also related with economic development. From the data, what we found particular, this is related with Whittlesey, is that there are multiple forms of diversity in Whittlesey and in other local government areas, in these high growth areas, even where I live in Wyndham Vale. I think that the diversity is increasing by the day. As the population increase, there are different diversity that can be exhibited. We also found a range of indicators which are related with social cohesion, both at the individual and community level in the local government area. And there are also processes and enablers of social cohesion, which we'll talk about a little bit down the line. In Whittlesey, this is what we found, what people told us basically, ethnic and national diversity, and cultural and religious diversity, geographic diversity, demographic diversity, gender diversity. So diversity is not just one element. There are different forms of diversity. And social cohesion as a policy which is used to manage diversity needs to deal with these all different diversities. But in terms of local policy or programs, there are two elements which are very important for social cohesion. One is the process of social cohesion, and the other is the enablers of social cohesion. The enablers of social cohesion are basically something like spaces of interaction, leadership for inclusion, accessible information, while the process for social cohesion could include behaviors in most of the cases, for instance, appreciating difference, in terms of recognition, understanding, and respecting people's differences, connecting across boundaries through different means, connecting with other people, cultures, and social boundaries. There are different processes in that, and being inclusive, valuing and including other people. So the next we did was, how do we know social cohesion is present? We went on and talked to people in terms of, how do you know if there is social cohesion in your community? I think the descriptors are at the individual level. If there is really social cohesion, there should be a sense of belonging. People should feel connected, included, and participate more, and friendship developed, they celebrate, they love, and opportunities, feeling safe, things like that. But at the community level, it's slightly different. It's about opportunities, employment opportunities, and the presence of diverse services, and inclusive services in particular. I will pass at this stage to Robyn.
Thanks, Kiros. Basically, to sum up, the findings actually pushed out some of the definitions from the literature. Could we just go back a screen? I'd just like to highlight, we popped the definition on the screen before this. Just to read that out. We basically, the people in the workshops told us a lot of stories, and they told us stories about, you know, when they saw people working together across diversity really effectively, like after the bushfires. And they told us stories about, you know, when things weren't so effective, like when older people would go walking in the park and not feel safe. And, you know, so we were able to distill all this down, and we actually got a definition that people really seem to resonate at the local level. That if you have social cohesion, you have a respectful and accepting community where people work together across boundaries and feel connected and included at multiple levels. And Kiros talked a bit about this. So what we wanted to do, if we could move on to the next slide, is we wanted to take these insights that we'd sort of gotten from bringing these different perspectives and knowledges together about the processes that enable social cohesion, the actual enablers, what those look like in practice, so practically, and then what kind of indicators a council could use to measure whether or not their community is becoming more cohesive over time. So we had a really practical mandate, and I like frameworks. And so what we, in the end, came up with was a place-based framework to operationalize the findings of this project that council could use and community groups could use to talk about social cohesion, to develop strategies to enable social cohesion, and then to test the extent to which those strategies have been successful. So here's the framework. Kiros has just brought it up for us. I would also like to acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Magursa Wallo, who was a great driver of many of the visuals behind this process, as well as assisting us with the academic conceptualization. And he actually designed this framework, which I think is really captures, as well as a visual can, a lot of what we've been talking about. So I'll talk you through it. Essentially, what we're looking at is to move from situations of social fragmentation, which always exist in pockets, even in highly cohesive societies, and in other societies exist more broadly, to move from situations of social fragmentation to situations of social cohesion. So if you think back, and I won't back us up, but if you think back about 3 slides back, Kiros was talking about those dichotomies between loneliness and belonging, and that those could be manifested both at the individual level, so an individual feels lonely or an individual feels that they belong, but it could also you could also see these kind of dichotomies at the community level, where communities might feel like they've got really strong boundaries and only people in this community talk to each other and they don't talk to anyone outside of their local group or their local circle, to where there's actually fluid boundaries and different groups and different organizations and people from different backgrounds frequently interact. So what the framework shows us is a process of moving for both individuals and communities as a whole from fragmentation to cohesion, and 3 enabling processes. So, we had a lot of findings of, things that were really interesting, but we wanted to distill this down into things that you could actually take away and remember and put on a diagram and keep front and center. And the 3 processes that came out in the Whittlesea context, I can't vouch if this holds for everywhere else in the world, but in that particular local context, the 3 processes that really mattered were spaces of interaction, so spaces that enabled people from different groups and different groups themselves to come together and meet and talk and build relationships, develop trust. Those kind of spaces, we had some great examples. The University of Third Age was using one of the local education buildings, and they literally had different community groups in each room, but they didn't stay separate. They would overlap and they would join each other's activities. And that was a classic space of interaction. Public open spaces are classic spaces of interaction. Parks, places where people will, run into each other and have an informal conversation and see each other repeatedly. So what the literature often refers to as third spaces are very important here. So we wanted to flag that creating spaces that enable and encourage and facilitate interaction across diverse groups are a really important enabling process. We also had a number of findings that pointed to the importance of leadership. So individuals and groups actually being really visible and really audible about standing up and saying, diversity is a strength. We're not just about, a kind of a white Anglo-Saxon mainstream in this place. We're not only working in English. We're not only working for those with full abilities. Everything is disabled access. Everything is multilingual. This is how we are going to work. And to make that statement and to make it visibly. And that was coming from certain people in council. It was coming from certain people around the community. And where we saw examples of that, what we termed leadership for inclusion, we could see that that was enabling that movement towards social cohesion. People were saying, because of this, I feel more accepted. Because of this, I feel safer. Because of this, it is easier for me to participate. So the other thing to note about this framework, and we can talk about it more because I'd like to move us soon to question and answer, but each one of those dot points, both for individuals and for local communities, are a high-level indicator. So when it comes to thinking about how enabling processes can facilitate the movement from fragmentation to cohesion, these are actually high-level metrics, and then there are specific metrics that are already collected by local governments, by the ABS, that can be used to measure this. So those 3 enabling processes, I neglected to mention accessible information, but that was in a sense the example of being able to, it was really the case of transparency and also being able to access information even if you didn't work for council, even if you didn't live in the population centre, even if you didn't speak English fluently. And we found that that was also an important enabler. So if we could move on to the next slide. That's just a quick summary. So we talked about enabling processes. We talked about high-level indicators. What we didn't do in this project, because it was a very initial project in the space, is we did not then drill those down into specific metrics. So each of those dot points is a type of indicator. Obviously, you can't measure it broadly. You need to develop specific metrics. Many of those already exist. Many of those the council was already collecting data on. So the next steps, which Kiros will talk about in a moment, would be how to then take this framework, which is intended to be very practical, and take it down to the next level of detail to be able to collect specific data and operationalize this vision of processes for inclusion.
I think some of the insights from the project, the framework does enable local governments to invest in activities that bring change. They can choose which activities to focus on and invest to move their communities from, for instance, one angle to the other angle, from fragmentation to social cohesion, if there are significant issues, for instance, in a certain local area. it's also important to note that this is the spaces of interaction are very useful, but not only for interacting in information, exchanging information only, but creating opportunities for communities to create trust and to talk to each other and create relationship. And local governments have also an important role in creating inclusive leadership. They should reflect their own communities. In that respect, they can create opportunities, an inclusive institution whereby different communities will play a role in the council, in the local government area. There is also, this project has also shown us that in terms of practical work in the ground, I think councils can identify innovative initiatives, and then if they invest in them, they should also be able to track the change over a period of time. As if I go back to this, if you see this, these are high-level indicators, but it's possible to create sub-indicators which would then show whether there has been significant change from loneliness to belonging. You can measure this through different, statistically speaking, you can measure this. So if the council invests in one area, it is possible for them to track the change over a long period of time, whether it's over 5 years period or 3 years period. So that's also an important insight. In terms of next steps, I think we'll share this. I will speak a little bit and then pass it to Robyn. What we thought we would do is we would like to test the place-based social cohesion framework and its applicability with different councils and organizations. We have already talked to a group of councils. I talked to a group of councils. They were very interested, but we haven't yet progressed. I think COVID-19 seems to have stalled our progress, but hopefully we'll be able to talk to them. And if there is enough interest, we should be able to test this in different councils. And that will help us develop social cohesion assessment tool. And perhaps we can also create baseline cohesion assessments in every council and to evaluate their progress, really. Robyn, back to you.
Yes, so this is basically where we'd like to take this. This was a very preliminary project, but it certainly turned up a lot that certainly the council found useful and that we thought had much broader applicability. It also really drove home to me that there were a lot of really interesting local initiatives which we started to turn up in the research, and that the council was quite interested in knowing what were some of these. Some of them they knew about already, some of them I think were quite new. And I think one of the things we'd like to look at in next steps is to actually identify some of these, as demonstration projects. Here's something that a local community has done that has really made a difference, and then share that for others to maybe take some inspiration from. So with that, we might just flip to the final slide. Those are just our references. Those are our contact details. If anyone would like to follow up and like more information or a copy of the report, but I think we'd like to turn it over for questions and comments from the amazing group we have. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Robyn and Kiros. I'm sure everyone really appreciated that presentation and all of the wonderful information that you provided and all of your insights. Hi, everyone. I'm on gallery view now. Great to see everyone. We've got a number of questions that have come through already, but feel free to ask them in the chat feed. You can message me privately or Beck, or ask them publicly to everyone. But I'll start off with one from Rosalind. This was earlier in the presentation, I think. How has this been evaluated and what has been the time frame for the process?
Okay, I'm happy to jump in there. So essentially, this was a project to develop, to co-design a framework with the community. So we haven't implemented the framework, so therefore it hasn't yet been evaluated. As we mentioned on the next steps, the next step would be to take this framework and actually develop up those indicators and try it out. You know, do the baseline assessment of, you know, and see if that resonates with stakeholders, and then do a bit of a follow-up in a year and see if that resonates with stakeholders. What we did do is we did test the framework itself. We circulated it around to a number of stakeholders after we developed it, and they really did like it. So, you know, that was the extent of the testing that we could do. But we are aiming to develop a tool that can actually be used for continuous evaluation and improvement. It's probably worth reflecting, because I thought it was very insightful when Belgin and Russell in particular, as local government practitioners, were reflecting at the beginning. We know this stuff matters, but we must make a decision to invest in things that we believe are going to build social cohesion. How do we articulate that? How do we justify that investment? And then how do we show whether or not it was a good investment? And that's the question that we're trying to help them answer.
Mm-hmm. We just had a question just now which relates from Caroline. Have you thought about using a developmental evaluation methodology to learn and shape as you implement it?
Yes, look, Kiros, I might, as our evaluation expert, I might let you field that one so they're not just hearing my voice.
Developmental evaluation is one way. We haven't yet decided what type of evaluation methodology we would use. Yes, because this is kind of a context which is changing constantly, and there is a lot of learning that we need to have. Developmental evaluation will be appropriate, but we haven't yet got to that stage. We need first the councils who would raise their hand, and then at that stage, I think we would determine. But also participatory evaluation methodologies might also work, because it's a sort of co-design model, and it requires all voices considered, and we need to see it from different angles. But yes, it's a good methodology to use.
A comment and question from Selena. Regarding spaces of interaction, it's been really interesting to see examples of how some local communities have created digital spaces of interaction to support each other through lockdown, for example, WhatsApp, Facebook. Perhaps these are an indication of communities that already had high levels of social cohesion, ? Might be interesting to compare communities where this happened and those where it didn't. Bit of a reflection question.
Look, I'll just bounce back, absolutely. And I think communities, local places have varied enormously in the extent to which they've been able to mobilise those sort of networks and transfer them into a digital space. So I think that's a good working hypothesis. It would be an interesting one to test.
From Rosalind, I'm just starting at the earlier questions, folks. From Rosalind, did you find that the process itself was acted as if to increase connections between diverse groups and individuals?
I'll let you field that one, Kiros. Your turn. I thought we'll just alternate.
Okay.
I think so. I think the words already, the community groups we did speak to were already groups working together, but there was a sense of, it was an inclusive process in many ways, because we had to, I think in most of the case there were evening meetings and everyone came together, and it was in a very relaxed mode. Some of them were during the day, and they brought people from different walks of life together. So it is a process which was also part of testing social cohesion, really.
Mm-hmm. Robyn, one for you from Lisa. Do you feel, or is there evidence from other studies, that this same framework could work for virtual communities or collaborative collectives?
That's really an interesting proposition. I think possibly yes. I mean, certainly, and I'm just reflecting back on Jane Farmer and the Social Connection webinar that they presented recently, you know, where they talked about different groups that have sort of created digital presences. And I don't know, but I suspect yes. I suspect, in a sense, that digital is a really interesting space to play in, because so many of the visual markers of difference are not present. So it actually might be easier in some cases to enable, sometimes people feel safer in a digital space. They don't have to reveal as much of their identity in a digital space. It would be an interesting one to try. I would be hypothesizing wildly in either direction, but I'm leaning to it. I think it possibly could.
From Letitia, this is for you, Kiros. Do you have specific metrics to measure the framework?
The high-level indicators themselves are measurable. So after that, the next step is you can have different indicators at outcome level. There are several. We are currently developing outcome indicators for a different project, but there are a list of outcome indicators you can use. You can also relate these to the sustainable development goals, but they are at the impact level, at a country level, not at the local level. So there are different metrics that you can use. It depends on the local situation and where the focus of the investment is. And then you have to take what metrics you can use. It has to be used differently in different contexts, so to say.
Okay. From Nicholas. Hi, I was expecting to see politics and education among the enablers. I saw politics but missed education. Don't you think education at primary, secondary level is very relevant to improve cohesion? One for you, Robyn.
No, good comment. Thanks, Nick. I think yes, but that to me was kind of wrapped up in the leadership arena. So the leadership came, and in fact, we had a couple of really good examples of leadership coming from schools. And so we weren't looking at particular subsectors of the community, like particularly influencing children or young people, but we were looking at leadership broadly. Who in the community was actually making a stand for social cohesion? Who in the community was making inclusion part of daily practice? So, yes, education, is certainly there in the background in terms of elements, things like access to education. But I think the actual educating of people and sort of saying, you must embrace diversity is less effective than the example of leaders coming forward and just saying, this is how we're going to do things. And then the creation of spaces, whether that's in schools or whether that's in community groups or whether that's in the council itself, where people can come together. So that was really, when I think about it, there were moments in the study where I did feel like people were parroting, diversity as a strength. And I was like, do they really believe that, or have they been taught it? So it's a little bit of a provocation back, but I actually think being told to believe something is not the same as being shown that it works.
Mm-hmm. From Rosalind, it's often found that those who are most isolated are the hardest to reach. And my opinion is, and a few other people have commented about this, what about those who aren't online? Any ideas how to ensure they are included?
Look, that is such an important, oh, sorry, I think this was Kiros's. Can I steal this from Kiros? Because, and then you can jump in, I'm out of turn. It's so important, and it came up really clearly in the study. And this is one of the things we realized early on, that there are so many forms of diversity. And things like age and isolation, geographical isolation, physical isolation, did come up very strongly. And that was actually one of the threads that fed into that third enabler around access to information, because we had people coming along saying things like, I'm kind of on my own, and my grandchildren come up to see me, and I don't know anyone in the community, and I don't know where to take these children, and I can't get information. And someone else in the same room said, oh, that's on the council website. But no one had ever shown them that that there were groups and there were all sorts of activities going on. So, I think it's something that does not have an easy answer, but recognizing that social isolation and the levels of social connectedness at that individual level actually play into, an obstacle to social cohesion. just sort of opens up that space for us to think about, well, what are some creative ways to make those connections for people that are isolated? Because generally the services and facilities and networks are out there, but it's about how do you actually give people access to that information.
Ironically, Sian, I think I'm saying that right, is in 2 meetings at the moment. So she's listening to this, she or he, sorry, and also in another meeting, but has asked the question and made a comment. How did the non-community development areas of council take to the words social cohesion? Was it truly taken on board as something local government should get involved in? Obviously, this view varies by state to state and council to council. And by the way, I think, yes, absolutely.
Good. Kiros, I'll hand this one over to you. I won't hold the microphone.
I think that if I understood it correctly, the question is other parts of the council, people working in the council, how do they understand the term social cohesion? So in this particular project, we had actually a large group of council workers, 2 groups in a consultation. So we had a broader discussion with them because they're from different parts. And one of the processes we took them through is to see what their understanding of what social cohesion is for them. So there were diverse views, but in the end, there were discussions and they had to come up with definitions. So I think our definition is, if you like, kind of a summary of what everyone thought social cohesion is about. So there was a discussion in terms of creating common language within the council.
From Anne, how was the initiative funded? Is Willisley Council continuing its interest and or investment in building social cohesion? Robyn?
So this was a partnership project. We do a few of those. So basically, Whittlesea funded it and we put in some co-funding, some in-kind contributions as well because of the strategic importance of the project. And that was a phase 1 initial project. And the plan has always been to move forward with phase 2, but there's just been delays around other urgencies with the COVID-19 situation. But the idea is to move forward. And as Kiros mentioned, we've actually had interest from other council areas, particularly in the peri-urban or interface councils around, could this process also be applied in their council? Could they test the framework in their council area? So we're really hoping that this, once the current situation calms and councils can get back to a bit of their business as usual, that we'll be able to further deepen this work.
From Letitia, but I have one more question left. So to everyone who's here, please feel free to ask more questions in the chat feed. And if I have missed your question, please copy it again because I was scrolling through the chat feed. How many people from the test community were involved in the design? What inclusion mechanisms did you consider to ensure meaningful participation?
Kiros, I'll let you field that one.
So we went through a process of how to select to include everyone. So it was an inclusive process because it's a partnership project. We worked with our colleagues from the council to ensure that it's quite an inclusive process. And in the end, I think I have the number 100 plus, so whether 102, not exact, but it was around 100 people who participated in the consultations. So I think it was 8 groups, 100 people.
A few more questions. How would the framework apply in other local councils and how might it differ based on different demographics?
Well, that's a question that I'd really like to test in practice. I mean, I think the principles are there and may well be similar, but you're going to deal with a different group of people with different preoccupations. I mean, the sort of things that came up in this particular context, I mean, obviously the cultural and ethnic and linguistic diversity was a big one, but as Kiros listed all those sources of diversity, the rural-urban diversity was a really interesting one. So there were, you know, the outer fringe of the local government area was very rural, whereas, you know, there is quite metropolitan feeling toward the south. Also, the socioeconomic diversity was very marked, and the diversity between the kind of older communities and newer communities, not all of which were necessarily, you know, English-speaking or non-English speaking, but some of the older ethnic communities that had been there for a long time and those that just sort of begun to establish themselves. And, you know, some of those you'll see in other places, but there may be other points of diversity that are particularly outstanding in other places. And that may well influence the kind of enablers and the kinds of indicators. I suspect the enablers and indicators are generic enough that most of them would be applicable in other contexts, but that's something to test.
Yeah, I think to add to that, in principle, they will generally work in broader ranges of councils, but because of the dynamics and the difference in demographics and other diversity, the focus in each council or which ones are more used in terms of indicators would be different from council to council. That's what I would expect. We still have to test it, but that's my expectation, is that the differences will be quite nuanced in the sense that in some councils, they will have different dynamics, contextual dynamics, which may not necessarily exist in other councils.
Okay. Letitia just wanted to follow up on her question. It was a bit more specific. How did you intentionally ensure engagement of people who might have barriers to participation? For example, people with disability, people with English as a second language, families with young children. What did your consultation process look like?
Kiros, did you want me to field that one? I can do.
Yeah. So so we had a wider discussion in terms of including everyone. So there were people with disability, because there was so the process they went through is there are organizations within the council which represent different diverse groups. So they went a length in terms of inclusion to include everyone. I think to include voices which you may not necessarily hear every now and then. So they went through a process and screened all, and we had long discussions to make sure that everyone is included. It's a fair process. So I'm confident that still we might have left some groups, but it was quite inclusive process.
Mm-hmm. One last question, a bit of a plug from Rosalind. She's involved in a Swinburne project which has identified issues important in our local community and assisting our community to address these. She thinks there's many parallels with this. Any comments from the presenters?
Oh, just that I'd like to hear more about the project.
Rosalind, feel free to email me and I'll put you in touch. Oh, in fact, Robyn shared her email, but I can get that to you easily. That is it for the questions. Robyn or Kiros, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, look, I would just like to thank all the participants for their engagement today. It is a really interesting topic. I certainly enjoyed working with colleagues on this project, and hopefully, you know, we will have opportunities to continue to work in this space. So if you're doing work on social cohesion, or if you're working in a council or an organization that's grappling with this, please do feel free to reach out to Kiros or myself for a conversation, a virtual coffee, whatever works, because I think this is a space that's really important going forward. And the more we can bring our different knowledges together, the more we can really create positive social impact. So thanks so much to everyone.
Thank you. Kiros?
Thank you. I think for me, it's the point of difference here is that oftentimes social cohesion is discussed at the national level, I think, but its importance is at the local level. So let's work together to bring it to local areas to enable people really to live together and to prosper together.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to both of you. We all really appreciate it. I will share Robyn's and Kiros's emails in the follow-up email I send in the morning. We're getting a lot of comments saying thank you in the chat feed. This was fantastic. I found this interesting. Great. This is our third last webinar for Impact 2020. So I encourage you to get along to tomorrow's and Fridays. They should be really good. It'll be interesting after the last webinar. I'll be very excited. It's been a big 6 weeks. Thanks again to Robyn and Kiros and to Beck for being moderator. I hope to see you in the next 2 webinars. That's it for now. Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Rhonda.
Bye.